Psy-war, gaslighting, and Stockholm Syndrome. We need to be able to apply the Lordship of Christ to all areas of life. The whole purpose of Psy-war is to undermine an enemy's will to resist. You need to realize that you have been targeted by the New World Disorder, the powers that should not be. They are seeking to undermine your willingness to resist. You are the enemy to the New World Disorder. Psychological warfare, or Psy-war, involves tactics intended to manipulate your opponent or your enemy. The goal is undermine an enemy's willingness to resist. This includes the dissemination of propaganda and disinformation to undermine the morale of enemy forces. That's us, remember? You, the enemy of these folks who are trying to subjugate the world into their globalist New World Disorder idea. And they try to erode your ability to resist. Just think of how during the masquerade madness, the lockdown lunacy, the salvation by vaccination, COVID cult, how you were given disinformation, fear. They gave fear porn every day to get you absolutely paralyzed, to shut down churches, to shut down your businesses, to get you to lock down, to get you to mask up, to get you to comply, to be subjugated, and to erode your willingness to resist. In the military, we use terms like Psy-war, or psychological warfare, or PSYOPs, psychological operations. In the South Vietnam, it was called COMOPs, or communications operations. And it's also been known as winning hearts and minds, and political warfare and propaganda. But we're talking about the same thing. But that's in the military, but now civilians are targeted too. Normally, military intelligence distinguishes between PSYOPs' own forces, or COMOPs' own forces, to build up the morale of your own people. And then there's PSYOPs' enemy forces, which is to break down the morale of enemy soldiers and their civilian population. I was infantry, but during my call-ups in Citizens Force, I got transferred to military intelligence and actually spent time working on PSYOPs' enemy forces. And I would conjure up ways of breaking down the morale of the communist forces, the terrorists, and we produced films, cartoons, comics, a whole range of interesting things, including rumors that would break down the morale of the enemy. And so I know how it works. There's PSYOPs local population as well, where you seek to win over the hearts and minds of those in the operational area. This could be as simple as sending in some doctors, medics to work, help the people medically in the area, have soldiers equipped with sweets and so on to distribute to the local population, organizing a bribe for the local population, just different things to make them feel happy about the occupiers, especially in the case of the Americans. They're occupying so many countries, and they've got to make people happy about being bombed and targeted by drones, and to say, well, you know, some of the Americans are actually quite nice. They helped our village, they repaired this, they built us a well or a water pump, and so on. So PSYOPs local population is an important part of the work. You see their motto, persuade, change, and influence. That's the logo or the slogan for PSYOPs local population in the American Army. The whole aim of PSYOPs is aimed at emotions and values. PSYOPs recognize the need to target their audience's belief system, their value system, their emotions, their motives, their reasoning, their behavior. And so they will use imams, they will use ministers, they will use entertainers, singers, musicians, of course, journalists, presenters on radio and TV programs, and they'll use activists on the streets. Now, this is a Muslim newspaper, and look at this picture, a young boy sleeping with his parents, and hashtag Syria. And this is part of the propaganda they were doing against the Syrian government. And by the way, this is a complete fake picture. Those aren't graves, they just heaped up stones, and that boy did not lose his parents, he's just a paid actor. And this is typical. You have a heartstring pulling picture and story, sob story there, and then you find out later it's completely fake. Some countries have resorted to false flag or black ops to discredit the enemy forces by terrorist operations that can be attributed to the enemy. So, for example, it's been proven the American government organized the Oklahoma City bombing, which targeted the ATF on the 5th anniversary of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearm group targeting and burning a whole Christian community, which were called a cult, at Waco, Texas. So on the 5th anniversary of that, when they were being investigated in Congress, the headquarters for ATF in Oklahoma was blown up. But funnily enough, there wasn't one single ATF agent or FBI agent in the building at the time of the bombing, nor any of their children in the children's creche, which was in the same building either. On that day, they were all absent. And then, interestingly, a whole lot of the journalists who were investigating this suddenly disappeared, were tortured to death, and all sorts of strange things happening. The one radio station in Oklahoma City that didn't follow the narrative and said, but there were 2 explosions and so on, and showed the evidence, they got bought up by a conglomerate in, I think it was New York, and next thing they were all silenced, and people who asked too many questions disappeared, turned up dead, all sorts of horrible things. So we've got the documentary, and you can actually see it on YouTube, A Noble Lie, Oklahoma City bombing 1995. And that's a case of false flag. The Clinton government actually bombed one of their own buildings before 9/11, the worst terrorist attack to ever take place in America, just done by the American government. And then there's the chemical hoaxes. Every single time Syria has been accused of using chemicals or gas against its people, it's been proven to have been a false flag, normally organized by a NATO member, Turkey, and they supply the gas, and then it's attributed to the Syrian government. And then the response, the Americans can shoot a few more cruise missiles into Syria and destabilize that country, which was one of the few countries in the Middle East that actually protected Christians from persecution. There's all sorts of bizarre things. The anthrax terror attacks in Washington, D.C. were found to all be done by the Americans themselves to get people whipped into hysteria and to get them all to accept the extra laws that were infringing on their freedoms. There's the assault on the USS Liberty ship, which is a well-documented false flag operation. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, where Vietnam torpedo boats apparently attacked American battleships and aircraft carriers. Must have been the bravest torpedo boat commanders in history. You know, take a little torpedo boat to go and attack these massive, a whole fleet of aircraft carriers, destroyers, battleships. And that started America's involvement in the Vietnam War. That why would Vietnam be so stupid as to want to start a war with the United States, who had vastly more resources than they did? But that justified the bombing campaigns on Vietnam, and it's admitted now. Yes, it was a false flag. Yes, we did it ourselves. It wasn't the Vietnamese who attacked us at all. It was a completely rigged, manipulated false flag operation. And there's worse than that. You can see we've got a Christian Action newsletter on false flags and deception operations. And that includes NATO organizing Operation Gladio, where they actually did terror attacks randomly on people in Europe. Italy, France, Spain, Germany, terrorist attacks organized by NATO to panic the people in Europe to be willing to accept less freedom and more government intrusion. Literally everything from hijacking planes, blowing up people in public places, carjackings, all sorts of things, bombing of trains, organized by NATO itself on their own population. And these are proven. This is not a theory. These are, I'm just giving some of the cases of actual cases where governments in the West, free democratic countries, have involved themselves in terror attacks on their own population, and the United States government, Operation Mockingbird, even hijacking of aircraft in America organized by the US government. There's a British MI6 authority who has stated that every terror attack in the United States of America has been organized by the US security services. Every one. Now, I don't know if that's true. I'm just stating what MI6 claimed, that all the terror attacks inside America have been organized by the US government. And there are people who will go as far as saying 9/11 was an inside job, but I'm not going to touch that one. Psychological warfare is no longer limited to soldiers. If you hadn't noticed, targets of SARPs now include the civilians, groups, churches, organizations, governments. I can even say missions are targeted by SARPs. And they use media technology to target the population. And it's easy. Just look at some of these stats here. Every 60 seconds, there are 98,000 tweets. On Skype, there's 370,000 voice calls on Skype every 60 seconds. 12,000 new ads posted on Craigslist. 13,000 hours of music streamed on Pandora. And we're talking about going through all these different things. Just take Facebook, 500,000 comments every 60 seconds. And how many of those do you think are organized by government agencies? And status updates, 650,000 on Facebook every minute, 79,000 wall posts. That's just Facebook. Then you've got search inquiries in Google, 694,000 every minute, and 168 million emails are sent. And the amount of things censored, even Mark Zuckerberg admitted they removed 8 million posts just in 2020 on Facebook. I mean, that's a lot of censorship. So if you wondered why all right-thinking people agreed and all scientists agree and all doctors agree, well, they were taking down all the doctors who disagreed and all the scientists who disagreed. So yes, there's a lot of censorship going on. And you just think of YouTube posts 600 new videos every hour, every minute. And there's huge amounts of interaction going on in the media. Technology and media are increasingly being used to affect political changes desired by the enemy or revolutionary forces. So just think, for example, there was a time when billionaires controlled what you think. You had to be a billionaire to run a newspaper. And so there was a time when all the newspapers in South Africa were owned effectively by Anglo-American, Oppenheimer and so on. They ran the whole deal. And you couldn't get a newspaper that didn't echo the mantra, the narrative, whatever it was. In America, there are 6 organizations that control all the media in America. And they all have a common denominator as well. But we won't mention that in case somebody accuses us of being anti-Semitic. So there's a massive control of the media. And do we really think that they're going to let you get away with having an alternative opinion? But that all changed with Facebook and other social media. And then you had the Trump revolution, 2016, where Donald Trump won the election, even though the entire media was against him because of social media. And that's when fact checkers came in and censorship on the internet began, because they had never intended Facebook to be used to advance the gospel or political agenda. It was meant for you to show, this is a picture of my cappuccino that I had at Starbucks today. And, that's what Facebook's meant for. Not for you to share the gospel and for you to advance a counter-revolutionary political agenda. The same year, 2016, Britain voted for Brexit. And all the media in Britain was against Brexit. All the political parties, even the opposition, the government, all of them were against Brexit. But Brexit won because of social media. And that's why since 2016, your posts that might have gotten a huge impact before suddenly got throttled. They called it shadow banning. There's different ways of them doing it. But since 2016, Facebook and so on have employed thousands of censors, what they call fact checkers. Like Satan was a fact checker in the garden. Did God really say? And so Satan's the first fact checker. And now you've got you never had fact checkers before the truth started to get out. And so they didn't expect their technology to be used against them. Through fake news and peer pressure, people are being taught to self-censor to avoid expressing views that could get them unfriended. We saw this most blatantly in 2020. You would question or bring out facts that undermine the narrative of the whole lockdown lunacy, masquerade madness, salvation by vaccination, COVID cult. And next thing, warning, you will be deplatformed, you'll be, unpersoned and all that. You'll disappear down the memory hole. And we learned after a while, well, you can't post this and you can't say that. And they were very, very careful. I would post something and within seconds, not even a minute, fact checkers have shown this as fake news and so on. And they couldn't have even read the thing. It must be a keyword, and next thing, fact checkers and blocked, and my whole screen goes blank, and all of that. Whole Facebook pages that we had disappeared. And they've got all kinds of ways of they cyberbully you, and they accuse you of cyberbullying if you bring up the facts. Facts can really ruin a good narrative. Now, if you can remember back to the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese commander famously declared, the Viet Cong did not win the war on the battlefield. They lost the war on the battlefield. They won the war on the campuses, the university campuses, and in the living rooms of the United States of America through television coverage of American protests against the war. The protests and the media coverage lost the war for America. The soldiers might be winning spectacular battles on the field. Even things like the Tet Offensive of 1968, which the American Army won. It was presented in such a way that it was seen as a failure in America and a defeat. And so the media turned victories in the field into defeats on the TV screens, and the American people turned against the soldiers and the war and the army, and before you knew it, the pressure was unbearable, and the US government had to withdraw and leave it. Catastrophic mess. They literally pushed all kinds of helicopter, gunships, Hueys, and so on into the ocean because they didn't have enough space on their aircraft carriers for all the helicopters evacuating and to accommodate all the refugees that were now on these ships. They abandoned thousands of helicopters. They pushed vast amounts into sea, which was very traumatic for us to watch in Rhodesia. We only had 40 helicopters in the whole of Rhodesia during the war. And to see precious helicopters, which we had to smuggle in from overseas to help us in our war effort, just pushed into the ocean by the Americans, that they could waste millions upon hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment like that. It just showed the waste of the whole thing. But when they decided to abandon their ally, South Vietnam, and evacuate from Vietnam, the amount of expensive equipment left behind or pushed into the ocean, absolutely staggering. Now, the Prime Minister of Rhodesia, Ian Smith, who's been a guest in this Livingston House, I've interviewed him on radio and TV, good friend, he declared, "We were never beaten by our enemies. We were betrayed by our friends." And his book, The Great Betrayal, documents that. President P.W. Botha of South Africa and his granddaughters completed a Great Commission course here and is now a missionary in Ukraine. His daughter is a very good friend of ours too. President P.W. Botha tried to warn South Africans of the total war which was targeting every aspect of life in South Africa. And the mass media derided this total war. They made a big joke about it. But history has proven President P.W. Botha was correct. We had a strong government, a strong country, a strong economy, and yet we were undermined. We weren't beaten by our enemies, we were betrayed by our friends. When Southern Africa was aflame with communist revolution, and we had Soviet-backed, Soviet-trained, Soviet-armed terrorist groups operating in Angola, the MPLA, Frelimo in Mozambique, ZANU and ZAPU in Rhodesia, SWAPO in Southwest Africa, the ANC and PAC in South Africa, and there was a total communist onslaught on the country. They were not just attacking us on the land, they were attacking us from sea. These are South African Air Force pictures taken of Soviet and Chinese vessels around our shores. That were huge amounts of fishing trawlers coming. Apparently the fish around South Africa are so important and so good, they had to sail all the way from the North Sea and the Arctic Circle down here to be able to fish in the Cape waters, because this is an important choke point, an important shipping lane, and they were spying on us. This was all espionage vessels. See the hem and sickle on the turret, on the funnel there? And these are Air Force intelligence pictures taken, because these are just documentation monitoring the Soviet espionage going on around us. This is a Soviet battleship in Luanda Harbor in Angola, and Soviet High Command arriving in Luanda Harbor in Angola during the Cold War. Cuban tanks, trucks, armored cars coming out of vessels coming from Havana, Cuba, into Angola at Luanda Harbor. Soviet tanks in the streets in Angola, in this case, Huambo. And these are some of the MPLA soldiers called the FNLA, I should say, the FAPLA. These were the enemy that we were fighting. Fidel Castro was the surrogate being used. Just as Zelensky is a pawn for the Americans today in a surrogate war against the Russians, Castro was the surrogate for the Soviets back during the Cold War in their war against the Americans. And Castro had troops in 13 countries in Africa. He had 50,000 Cuban troops in Angola at any one time. And Fidel Castro visiting one of his colonies, Here you've got Agostinho Neto, drunken psychotic Marxist poet, to quote a report on him. You can see the Cuban flag and the Angolan flag at the airport in Luanda, and the Cubans marching in Luanda. This was the Cold War. We were facing a total war. The Russians were putting missiles in Cuba, but they're putting missiles in Angola as well. And their MiGs were strafing our troops and UNITA freedom fighters in Angola. Here's a picture we captured from the enemy. You can see the Marx brothers, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin on the wall. Soviet Russians instructing the Angolans. In Angola, there's a picture of the Angolan president on the wall too. This picture was kind of set up to document South African officer and soldier outside the window, a P-76 Russian tank that had been captured, and then our guys put the Fidel Castro and Brezhnev pictures from other parts of the room against the wall so that you could document the SWAPO posters, the Soviet rank structure, the notebooks, the manuals that they were being trained with in a classroom where the Russians were training SWAPO and ANC terrorists in Angola during the Cold War while fighting us. Our guys had just done a raid, captured him. First documented, captured cases of multiple grenade launchers that the Soviets had supplied SWAPO with in Angola. And South Africa was subjected to a total war. The South African Defence Force was spectacularly successful on the battlefield and on the borders of Southwest Africa. We did preemptive strikes into communist-controlled Angola, and here's some of the documentation of the Soviet tanks burning, our MiGs taking off, I should say our Mirages taking off, their MiGs being shot down, and this was news at the time, Russian MiGs being shot down by the South African Air Force, and Hind helicopter gunship taken down, destroyed totally in Angola. At one hostile press conference in Windhoek, Colonel Dion Ferreira, or Big Daddy as he is called, head of the 3-2 Battalion, he is the operational commander of Ops Modular, Ops Hooper and Ops Packer. These are the last battles of the war. And he was challenged to respond to accusations that the South Africans had actually been beaten in the just concluded battles in Angola. So Commander Ferreira responded with tongue-in-cheek, if defeat for South Africa meant the loss of 31 men, 3 tanks, 5 armored vehicles, and 3 aircraft, then we lost. If victory for FAPLA and the Cubans meant the loss of 4,600 men, 94 tanks, 100 armored vehicles, 9 aircraft, and other Soviet equipment valued at more than R1 billion, then they won. And here's the evidence. You've got no end of wreckage of the Soviet Empire in Angola. And you can see it today. I mean, it's overgrown much, but they're still there. They're not going anywhere. Armored cars, tanks, whole graveyards of Soviet weaponry. You can even spot them from outer space. If you Google the Lomba River, you can actually see the Soviet tanks and armored cars where the SADF roasted them back in 1989. 88 and 89, the last battles of the war. The Battle of the Lomba River, which has been well documented, there's whole books on the last hot battle of the Cold War. And General Keldenese's book even asked us if one of his old troops would please publish some of the stats. And we've got on the books on display and in our bookshop on how the Soviets lost the war in Angola, which was a summary of his books, which we published for him. But our country was not just being attacked on the borders, we were being undermined by subversion, sedition, and sabotage within the country. For example, blowing up of, in this case, a butchery. This is a limpet mine. And the attack on St. James Church of England, which is just down the road here, which at the time was just a couple of blocks from our mission headquarters in 3rd Avenue, Kenilworth. And one of our missionaries was the one who shot back and shortened the attack and sent them fleeing. This was the scene that I saw when I went into church after the attack, 25th of July, 1993. Absolutely hideous. Jared Harker, 21-year-old, leapt upon the hand grenade that landed in the aisle to save the lives of the people around, because these hand grenades had been strapped with nails around them to give bigger impact of shrapnel. And they hurtled 2 hand grenades into the congregation, and Jared Harker leapt on one and absorbed the full impact in his body to try and save the lives of the people around him. Remember the Magoo bombing in Durban on the Marine Parade? On university campuses, in the classrooms, in the media, on the streets, there was insidious sedition to subvert the public. Every kind of attack. The ANC could justly be described, to quote Margaret Thatcher, as the most spectacularly unsuccessful revolutionary movement in the world. And they were. They had not one single victory to their name. In 30 years of so-called armed struggle, they didn't manage to win a single victory. But their allies in the South African Council of Churches and their allies in the universities and the editors of many newspapers and Hollywood and their allies in sports boycotts and disinvestment campaigns, sanctions, general psychological warfare, the economic warfare, the sanctions, disinvestment, political warfare waged by the Soviet bloc, that managed to, with the aid of the European Union and the Organization of African Unity and the British Foreign Office and US State Department and the United Nations, they managed to gradually wear down a lot of the South African population. Not all of us. Some of us would still be happy to be fighting, but they brought the majority of the National Party to a point where they were willing to settle for a negotiated settlement with the defeated ANC. ANC might have lost the battle, but they managed to have a carrot. In exchange for international sports, you can play cricket with Australia, you can play rugby with New Zealand, you can participate in the Olympic Games, just give away your country and we'll give you a ball game. Something like carrot and stick approach. The sticks were economic sanctions, disinvestment, boycotts, bans, riots, sabotage, bombings, sporadic acts of terrorism at home, increasing condemnation from abroad. This is the way brats work. You have a brat at home, I want these sweets. Mommy doesn't want to give it. They fall themselves down on the floor in the shopping center and start screaming, banging the floor with their fist, throw a temper tantrum. Mommy, okay. And then they give them the sweets. They learn terrorism works. And so you throw a temper tantrum in the streets, have riots, smash windows, go berserk. This is how it graduates from being a young brat to being a teenage brat on the streets. And so they use the carrot and stick approach. And as a result, we got the chance to participate in the international rugby tours, cricket tours, and 1992 in the Barcelona Olympics. Although we weren't allowed to carry our own flag, we had to have an Olympic flag, something like this, white flag. And but South Africans actually managed to participate in the Olympics for the first time in decades. So PSYOP's propagandists target their adversaries by seeking to destroy, by psychological means, their morale and their confidence, to the extent that they begin to doubt the validity of their beliefs, their actions, and their values. And this is the PSYOPs we experience in South Africa. Every single damn day, the Cape Times and the Argus would publish something undermining the morale of people. The pictures, the stories, they would continually make you think ill of your soldiers. They'd make you think ill of your history. They came up with no end of garbage. I mean, just one stupid newspaper headline I saw was how Jan van Riebeeck, the founder of South Africa, was actually sent here as a punishment. Now, this is the most important Dutch East India Company overseas outpost. And they claim that the man they sent to be the governor here was actually sent here as punishment because they suspected he was involved in some underhand activities, that he'd been involved in corruption or something. That is not even logical or possible. And it's not historically accurate. They investigated an accusation against him from people who were jealous of his success, and they found it to be baseless. But now some university professor at UCT came up with this bizarre theory, and the Cape Times published it like fact on the front page of the newspaper. It's not even worthy of the classifieds. But that's the kind of thing they do, just to try and undermine the face that's on every Rand note. They reckon that's not even his face, it's the picture of somebody else. And also anything they could do to undermine the morale. Some might seem trivial, but when you put it together, when you've got thousands of these kind of articles and attacks, along with demonstrations, marches, protests. My mother, driving to work, had her car stoned, driving past UCT, and there's these students on the banks of UCT throwing stones at the people driving, and she gets her car window broken. And this kind of harassment, time-wasting nonsense, everyone being disturbed. You're trying to get into Cape Town, but there's riots. I remember a day going down to Cape Town, every single window on Adderley Street was smashed. Riots and mobs. Chris Hani deal? Well, here's an ex-KGB agent, Yuri Bezmenov, who declared how the Marxist revolutionaries identify 4 stages of ideological subversion: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization. You know, you're 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Hammer pulls back, that's the normalization. Hammer comes down, but the goal is still driving in the nail. The highest art of warfare, he said, is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in the country of your enemy, until such time that the perception of reality of your enemy is so confused to such an extent he does not perceive you as an enemy. You can take your enemy without a single shot being fired. Well, they do that. They attack religion, education, media and culture, family, society, health, your race, population, labor. Their goal is a death wish, ignorance, uninformed myopia, addictive fads, mass media, and so on, false heroes, false role models. They want people to mistrust justice. They want less individual response. They want people to feel defenseless. Disunity, isolation, break up loyalty, enfeeble the masses. And that's why the KGB was running the drug trade for many, many years. Today, the Red Chinese secret police run most of the drug trade into America. Cuba's chief of intelligence is running drug trade into America too. There's a book in our library called Red Cocaine documenting this. They have decided, well, the young people who are going to form the backbone of the army, let's get them onto drugs. And they succeeded spectacularly in America. Most American soldiers in the Vietnam War were on drugs. And one of them was Oliver Stone, who, with the name Stone, yeah, he was stoned most time in Vietnam. He produced this Platoon film and things like this. And Oliver North, who was a Marine colonel, said, I heard more foul language in the 2 hours of that film, Platoon, than I heard in 2 years in the Marines in Vietnam. I mean, that's how totally unrealistic these movies are. And they're just designed to break down the morale. There's destabilization, and we know about destabilization in this country. There's crisis. Suddenly there's a major crisis, like Chris Hani being assassinated, which a lot of people still maintain to this day it was an inside job. And that Chris Hani was assassinated by the ANC's own goal because they removed his security that very day he got assassinated. And Chris Hani was the most eloquent, charismatic of all the ANC's leaders. He was also head of the Southern Communist Party. Chris Hani was going to be Mandela's vice president, and he'd be the next president of South Africa for who knows how long. So for Mbeki and Ramaphosa to have a chance, they had to get Chris Hani out the way. And Chris Hani, I've debated Chris Hani in public, so I know he's very eloquent. He's the best they had. And so next thing, Chris Hani gets assassinated. They blame Clive Derby-Lewis of the Conservative Party and this Polish chap they get jailed for it. But the ANC were the ones behind the assassination of Chris Hani. And this is believed by Chris Hani's widow. It's believed by Winnie Mandela, Bantu Holomisa, General Holomisa of Transkei. They said this was an inside job done by the ANC themselves. That crisis led to an explosion. Then later on you have normalization. You know, Mandela puts on a Springbok jersey and we get to win the World Cup in rugby, and then you have, you know, everything's good and hunky-dory and everything's lekker and Oom Nelson and things like this. But unprecedented mass communication media opportunities are manipulating emotions. How do you control a nation? You distract them, you deceive them, and you divide them. Distraction. The TV is a weapon of mass distraction. Modern mass media techniques have allowed unprecedented opportunities for foreign forces or your own government to engage in direct communication with the targeted enemy or enemy population. In recent times, the internet has allowed for campaigns of disinformation and misinformation never before seen. And this includes false flags and agent provocateurs to seek to discredit or character assassinate those whom they target. Just take the January 6th riots at the Capitol building. That is a monster distraction, character assassination, false flag. The head of the FBI has refused questions in Congress. How many FBI assets were inside the House of Congress on January 6th? Not willing to answer. He couldn't answer. I mean, it should have been easy, none. But he can't answer. Why can't answer? Because there's a lot of evidence that the FBI organized and ran the entire operation of the January 6th, which was designed to discredit Donald Trump and to distract people at the very moment that they were about to debate in Senate whether these votes were legit. They got 20 million more votes for old Biden back in 2020 than were cast in the most recent election. What happened to those 20 million votes between 2020 and 2024? And there's so much fraud, there's so much questions. The mail-in ballots were overwhelmingly Biden. And Trump's winning, and suddenly after midnight, it goes exponentially up just for Biden. And it's not possible, statistically impossible what happened there. But the way how the US government organized the January 6th riots in order to discredit Trump and to distract people from the authorizing or validating of the election results. The Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism recognized that while World War I and the military defeat of the Tsar provided a unique opportunity for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, violent revolution was unlikely to succeed anywhere in Western Europe. The Frankfurt School were Marxists who were trying to win Western Europe for communism. And they looked and said, Western Europe is too Christian. We've got to Marxize the inner man. The goal is to be cultural termites. We are going to have to use the termite strategy to erode the West from within. Antonio Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, advanced what he called the termite strategy. We call it the Gramsci strategy. And his goal was, you've got the pillars of society: education, entertainment, news media, religious institutions, political institutions. We need to erode from the inside all these cultural pillars of Western civilization. We must Marxize the inner man to get people in the West to think not only in a non-Christian mind, but turn them into an anti-Christian mind. This will take generations, but this is what you've got to do. We won't get a quick revolution in the West. And so Marxists need to work for a slow, gradual, long-term, culminative revolution by infiltrating the 5 cultural pillars and culture-transforming institutions of the West. And this is, of course, starting with education. The most important was capture the culture by infiltrating universities. By the way, anyone recognize this man? Blade Nzimande. You'd never guess that he's the head of the Southern Communist Party. He was Minister of Higher Education in South Africa for the last 10 years or so. If you want to know why universities are like they are, you'd never guess what he believes. News media, of course. Manufacturing consent is the way that they put it. And so news media has been captured overwhelmingly by anti-Christian Marxists. And by the way, the advertising, how do you like the fact that they used to advertise that expectant mothers need nicotine. You need to be smoking while you're pregnant. And how do you like this? Heroin tablets to be given to your kids. This does subdue them. But these are adverts. And then asbestos protects the buildings of your farm. Of course, you know, asbestos is not particularly good. No flies on me thanks to DDT, which is poison, of course. Manufacturing consent. It's been well documented, the lies. During the First World War, Woodrow Wilson went to Edward Bernays to establish the first propaganda department in the world. The Americans really pioneered it. And so Edward Bernays turned America from 80% isolationist and anti-getting involved in war in Europe to 80% for the war, where they were lynching people who were pacifists, even Amish, locking them up, and killing people just because they didn't want to go to war with Germany. So he turned the country from 80% against war to 80% for war, and they were happy to not just lynch Americans with a German surname or pacifist Amish people, but they're willing to beat to death Dachshunds and German Shepherds because those dogs were perceived to be unpatriotic. After the war, Edward Bernays became the leader of PR. PR is the first 2 letters of propaganda, but they needed a different name, and they called it public relations. And he convinced people He's got women smoking cigarettes, bananas, and fans, because those are some of the first things he did. Edward Bernays went to the tobacco company and said, I can double your customers. They said, how could you do that? Getting women to smoke. Women aren't going to smoke cigarettes. Give me the money, I'll do it. And he hired glamour models to march in the Easter parade smoking cigarettes, and he hired photographers to get the pictures of this, and then he paid newspapers to put those pictures on the front page of the newspaper. And he started to popularize the idea of women smoking, and they called them torches of freedom. You know, getting lung cancer and wrinkling your face and staining your fingernails and staining your teeth, that's all torches of freedom. And so the American Tobacco Company actually paid him to convince women that they should smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes to emancipate themselves. PR, which is short for propaganda, remember, must create news in order to appeal to the instincts and fundamental emotions of the public. And so, how do you like this advert? Light a Lucky and you'll never miss the sweets that make you fat. How's that for subtle advertising? An ancient prejudice has been removed. American intelligence, and this is from women going to the beach wearing dresses and bonnets and so on, to modern swimwear. Now the next way of showing you emancipated is to smoke cigarettes. An ancient prejudice has been removed. Women smoking, and 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating and toasted. And they sucked that number out of their thumb. I mean, they did no research. If you're a radio presenter, you need to smoke cigarettes that'll protect your lungs and protect your throat. And if you want a long-lasting relationship, you should both smoke. Lucky Strikes forever and ever. Well, maybe in the grave, but I suppose you can reach eternity quicker. So propaganda, notice the target is a woman smoking. And that's the textbook on propaganda by Edward Bernays. So we're living in a world today that's made up of fake people, fake food, fake medicine, fake weather, fake news, fake history, fake pandemics, fake revolutions, fake spirituality. I would say you also have fake elections, fake governments. Biden's government's been a fake government for the last 4 years. You've got fake, so many things. I'm afraid we've got fake gospels and fake churches too. Whenever there's a big story in the media, look around for the story they're trying to distract you from. So the entertainment industry is a key part of Hollywood. I will set no wicked thing before my eyes, we read in the scripture. Religious institutions are also being hijacked, of course, and political institutions, obviously. By the way, when Newsweek, or should I say Newspeak, published this on their front page newspaper, they whited out the background. So they had Mandela, Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela, and Joe Slover, the KGB colonel, with a clenched fist salute. But they thought people might be a bit distracted by the big hammer and sickle and red flag behind, so they whited that out behind and put just a picture of the people without the flag they were standing in front of. You don't want to confuse people with the facts now, do you? The slogan of Gramsci was capture the culture. And so Herbert Marcuse is also part of the Frankfurt School of Marxists. He emphasized the importance of subverting the culture through obscenity, blasphemy, perversion, pornography. He said you should use swear words as verbal grenades to attack bourgeois Christian societies. And so he advocated we've got to bring swear words into plays, art, music, and of course later films. And it's interesting, when Hillary Clinton was asked, who is your role model? She said, Professor Herbert Marcuse. And by the way, when Bill Clinton was asked, who's your role model? President Bill Clinton said, Antonio Gramsci. Obscenity and blasphemy are weapons, they said, in psychological warfare to break down Christian civilization. And we have people like this trance character posing with a cross, and I bet hell is fabulous, with devil's horns on. This person is, in fact, whether they know it or not, playing a role in Psywar, to give the impression that the whole society has gone to hell in a handbasket, and you Christians are such a minority, and the silent majority must just shut up and keep silent, because we are dominating your society. We're taking over the streets, gay pride marches, whatever it is. This is the kind of blasphemy I have seen at a number of cases. And I've heard people say, if only Mary had had an abortion, we wouldn't be in this mess today. In other words, the real problem in the world is Christianity. Jesus Christ is the problem. If he could have just gotten aborted, think what a wonderful world we'd live in. You know, free for perverts and whatever else. So this is the kind of blasphemous antichrist. They're not pro-choice, they're anti-choice. Like, they lift up China as an example. In China, you had no choice. One baby, all the rest get killed. No more than one child per family. That was not pro-choice, and yet I've heard pro-choicers lift up Red China's one-child policy as an example that we should follow. They're not pro-choice, they're pro-death, they're pro-abortion, they're anti-Christ. Pastors and evangelists have been arrested and prosecuted for preaching what the Word of God teaches in Romans 1. Pastor Akka Green in Sweden was locked up for reading Romans 1 in a pulpit in Sweden concerning what the Bible says about homosexuality. Herbert Marcuse spoke about repressive tolerance. He wrote the paper, Repressive Tolerance, proposing we set up a victim coalition of people who can be convinced you're oppressed. And so they first said, you know, we're going to target the black people in America, that they're oppressed by everyone else. But then it was women are oppressed by men, and then it was gays are oppressed by Christians, and they keep finding a victim coalition. And now trans people are being oppressed and so on. And this cadre of people would become the new proletariat to accomplish the long march through the institutions of the West. These new oppressed would be brainwashed into thinking that their oppressors are biblical Christians. Just think Antifa. And their strategy included casting biblical Christians as narrow-minded bigots. You're all racists, xenophobes, homophobes, Islamophobes, misogynists, greedy. And all of this would be definition of what it meant to have white privilege. And so the whole Black Lives Matter or burn, loot, murder, Baal, Lucifer, Moloch kind of crowd, it's all predicated on the fact that we're a victim class and you Christians are the ones to blame. The new proletariat has taught the wonders of tolerance for everyone except Christians. Against Christians, though, intolerance must be practiced at every turn. And so he gave justification for this new intolerance. Liberating tolerance would mean intolerance towards movements from the right. Toleration for all movements from the left. That's why burn, loot, murder, BLM could burn down whole cities and shopping malls, not a problem in 2020. But if somebody made a stand against perversion or something, then they were crushed. The police and the FBI could not prosecute people who were from the left, but they could prosecute even grandmothers for standing outside an abortion clinic and praying. So as to the scope of this tolerance and intolerance, it would extend to the stage of action, as well as discussion, and propaganda of deed as well as word. Propaganda is not just done by words, it's also done by actions. Like demonstrations in the streets is also part of propaganda. Toleration is a new device used to introduce a new law system as a prelude to a new intolerance. Notice the people who said that all censorship is wrong. But those people censored our book, The Pink Agenda, Sexual Revolution and the Ruin of the Family in South Africa. That book was the first book banned in the new South Africa. So they said all censorship is wrong. And then the gay and lesbian equality group under Evans Kirsten called for our book to be banned before it was even published. And then they banned it because Everett Kirsten won the censors in the South African Censorship Board. And then he praised himself for having banned it. I mean, so talk about conflict of interest. But that's the way they work. Of all the tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victim may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies, said C.T. Studd. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their conscience. We're dealing with moral busybodies. Karl Marx said the first battlefield is the rewriting of history. And this is where a lot of propaganda begins. Twisting history, distorting history, contorting it. And that's why we write history books and lecture a lot in history at the Reformation Society. The most effective way to destroy a people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. And so we need to understand Marxism and the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School, the Gramsci strategy, the role of Absenti and Marcuse's revolutionary strategy, and then you'll recognize where the violence in the campaign to topple statues and monuments and roads must fall and spray painting Absentis on the walls, where all this comes from. And graffiti on the walls is part of their way of breaking down society as well. And all this comes out of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, where you publicly humiliated and shamed and demanded apologies of the people who were about to execute, mind you, who were the old teachers and Confucians and so on. And so this is from the Cultural Revolution in China. They take respected leaders of their society and publicly humiliate them, force them to stand bowed with a condemnatory sign around their head and everyone screaming and shouting at them, and then they'd finally murder them. And this was China's Cultural Revolution. You know, you must apologize, you must kneel, you must say this, that, and the other, and so on. And George Orwell warned us about this in his prophetic novel 1984. He spoke of a new language, newspeak, thought police and thought crimes. Looks like you've had a little bit too much to think. Closed minds stop thought crimes. Support your local police, thought police. And opponents would be vaporized in 1984, made unpeople, and they'd disappear down the memory hole. And this is all warning us of what was coming. And then there's another prophetic secular person, Aldous Huxley, who warned us in the book Brave New World, there'd be a future sophisticated society where people would be distracted by endless entertainment stimulation and subdued by drugs, should be easily manipulated by the New World Order state. And that's where we are. And John Dewey, one of the authors of the Humanist Manifesto, was a pioneer of secular humanist state education in America. And we should be able to recognize how much of the entertainment industry is defiling and degrading us, intentionally. How much of the news media is discouraging and distracting you. And just look at these kind of stupid titles. Is your baby racist? And the gender revolution. And we're all Americans, but we're all Americans, just not legally. And welcome to America, like Mexico taking over America and so on. The child-free life, for goodness sakes. The new Europeans and all look like Muslims and so on. So this is what Sly Magazine, Newspeak, and Useless News and World Reporter bring out. The first victim of war is the truth, but you shall know the truth, and truth will set you free. So the music today, even invading churches, is degrading and depressing and disgracing in many ways. I would like to go into gaslighting, but I think we're out of time, so we need to break for tea time at this stage. But gaslighting is where basically the villain who's abusing blames the victim, and the victim feels guilty for what the abuser is doing to him. And that ties in also with Stockholm Syndrome, where you start to feel for your abuser and love your abuser. And I think you can see in South Africa, we've got Stockholm Syndrome, gaslighting, guilt manipulation, cyber, and it's not just South Africa, it's all over the Western world right now. If you've never seen the film Gaslighting, it's an Ingrid Bergman classic. And her abusive husband is actually the one who's trying to make her think she's lost her mind. And you may often think you've lost your mind if you actually imbibe all the garbage from the media. So we've got to support the alternatives.